Hello, this is Jim McKeeth, and welcome to day 5 of the Delphi Developer Bootcamp, Stepping Up to Mobile and Databases. We have a lot to cover today. We're going to talk about some of the characteristics of mobile platforms, how to move your code from desktop to mobile, and also look at databases with REST and FireDAC. Real quick about me, I'm the lead worldwide developer evangelist and engineer for Embarcadero Technologies. Been a long-time software developer. I love what I do. I love developing cool stuff. And I love using Delphi. So the objectives, I thought it was important to talk about this. Basically, what we're going to try and do is we're going to say, okay, so you have Starter Edition. What do you need to know to develop an app on Starter Edition so that when you get Pro with mobile add-on, you're able to move that app from Starter, from the Windows desktop, to mobile. So basically the idea is that we're going to use Starter as a prototyping platform to prototype an app that will be deployed to mobile. So let's talk about mobile platforms. Now we're going to do a little history here, talk about Retina displays or high DPI. If you go back to the original iPhone, it was 320 by 480, or actually I guess it was 480 by 320. No, 320 by 480, that's right. And it was fine. It was a nice phone. It looked good. And then they came out with the Retina phone. And the Retina iPhone was 640 by 960. So they doubled it horizontal and they doubled it vertical, the number of pixels. But they didn't cram more data on the screen, more text on the screen, or more icons on the screen. Instead, they made the text and icons look crisper, look sharper. They did this by increasing the dots per inch, the DPI. If you look at that picture there, you can see that the image looks better on the right because that's the high DPI version. So what happened is we had a separation between the pixels, physical pixels, and the logical pixels. So the physical pixels doubled, or quadrupled actually, since it doubled on the horizontal and the vertical. But then the logical pixels stayed the same. So the logical pixels stayed 320 by 480. So Retina uses higher density graphics. Now, later on, they actually changed the iPhone resolution because they made it longer, but that's beside the point. Right now, we're just talking about the concept of high DPI. So on Android is more complicated and it has low DPI, medium DPI, which is the standard, high DPI, and then extra high DPI, and also has different screen sizes. So medium DPI is considered the baseline. It's 1x. And then high DPI is 1.5, and extra high DPI is 2 times the density of the medium DPI. So these are some common resolutions for Android devices. So if you're going to build an app that you want to run on an Android device, if you're targeting one of these devices specifically, like for example, a Nexus 7 tablet or the Nexus 6P phone, then you might build your app, design your app at that logical DPI, okay? So make your form that size of the logical DPI. So if you're targeting Nexus 7, you would build your form 960 by 600 or 600 by 960, because phones are in portrait, whereas desktop screens are in landscape. And then here are some common iOS resolutions. Now, Apple did just announce the iPhone 7, which is probably going to be the same as the 6 and 6S. I don't remember if they said anything about screen size, resolution, density changes, but I suspect it will be the same as the 6 and the 6 Plus, or 6S and 6S Plus. So you'll notice that with the 6 and 6S Plus, they actually introduced a different logical and physical screen resolution from the 5 and the 4, and the SE, which is the previous generations. So they did change it at the 6, which is why I suspect the 7 is going to be the same size. And then there's the iPad, or the iPad Mini and the iPad Air. I think the iPad Pro I know is a different density, but I can't remember if it's a different logical. I think it's the same. It's still the 768 by 1024. But you can find out all those resolutions there at iOS Res. And then they check there and they don't have the iPhone 7 on iOS Res yet. So how do you deal with all these different screen densities? That is the multi-resolution bitmap. Now, by default or built in automatically, all of our styles use the multi-resolution bitmap behind the scenes so that they have the different resolutions necessary to support all these different screen densities. But if you're adding your own graphics in, then you can use the multi-resolution bitmap. Now, by default, if you only provide one resolution for your image, then it will scale it up and down as needed for the different screen densities. But if you want your graphics to look the best, you can provide them at the different screen densities. Now, the reason you want to do that as opposed to just providing at the highest resolution how it gets scaled down is because sometimes you'll have a graphic that has some detail in it that when you get scaled down, that detail just kind of becomes murky. Let's say, for example, you have a graphic that has text on it, and at a lower resolution, it would just look gray. It would become gray instead of white with black text. So you would instead maybe change it to just some simplified lines. So you would simplify your icon as it gets smaller. The classic example, actually, when iPhone introduced the Retina display, the New York Times app icon actually had an article, the text of an article in there, but because it was such a high resolution graphic, you couldn't see it unless you zoomed in. So that was kind of a little interesting bit of trivia that you could actually zoom in and read the text on the New York Times graphic launcher icon on the iPhone when they went to Retina. So by default with the multi-resolution bitmap, like I said, you can just provide the high resolution one and it'll get scaled down, or you can provide maybe a couple of them, maybe the medium DPI and the extra high DPI or something like that, and then it will interpolate and pick the best one for that and scale it up or down as necessary. But your graphics being scaled down are going to look the best. Graphics scaled up tend to not look very good. That's just a general rule of thumb for graphics. So let's talk about platforms and sensor components available on mobile devices. Now, there's common sensors. You have the T-location sensor, which uses your GPS and actually uses your GPS in combination with Wi-Fi and other things in order to get you a really accurate location. There's the motion sensor, which uses the accelerometer, orientation sensor, which gets gyroscope and compass. And then the sensor manager actually gives you access to other sensors. So there's a proximity sensor that can tell you how close the user is to the phone. There's ambient light sensors. It really varies from device to device, but there's lots of sensors there. Now you'll notice I have an asterisk on the motion sensor and the orientation sensor and say they're not usually available on Windows. I have a Windows tablet that has a motion sensor and an orientation sensor and a location sensor. It has all the sensors on it. So there's nothing that says these specifically won't work on Windows, but they're not commonly on Windows, especially like a desktop. The location sensor, because it uses the GPS as well as Wi-Fi triangulation and things like that, it may work on all devices. Windows tends to be very good about supporting that. It just really depends on the OS. The camera component works across all platforms, which is cool that it works on Windows, and we're going to use that in our example here. There's the media player and notification center also work across all platforms. Notification center, I'm trying to think actually if that works on OS 10. I know it works on Windows and mobile. I'm pretty sure it works on OS 10 as well. And with the notification center, you can do notifications. I've just never tried it on OS 10. It seems like I remember reading that it does. But anyway, it lets you do pop-up notifications. So you can display like on iOS and Android, you're familiar with notifications. You get those a lot. But on Windows, in Windows 10, they added notification support. And so the notification center works on Windows 10. It kind of sort of works on Windows 7. Microsoft didn't fully implement it on there. So it officially works on Windows 10. And then I believe it works on Mac OS 10 as well. Media player lets you record audio, playback audio and video. And then you have the gesture manager for interactive gestures, which are actually really cool, where you can use 2 fingers on mobile devices because they're multi-touch to like zoom in and twist and stuff like that. The gesture manager works with simple gestures on Windows. Actually, I think it does have some of the interactive gestures work on Windows too, if you have a touch interface. And then Stylebook, which we've talked about previously for custom and premium styles. Media library actions, these are things that are specific to mobile platforms. And this lets you do things like invoke the camera user interface. So this is different than the camera component. This brings up the camera user interface so that the user can tap to take a picture, and it says, you want to use this picture? And you say yes, and that takes you back into your app and gives you back that camera or that photo. Camera roll brings up the list of all the pictures they've taken with the camera and lets them choose one and then imports it back into your app. And then there's text and image sharing services, which then takes a bit of text or an image and sends it off to Twitter or Facebook or SMS, etc., for sharing. So those are media library actions. These are really easy to work with. We have lots of examples on these, but these are things that you can't use on Windows because Windows doesn't have that level of infrastructure under it on the OS level that you can then is available for you on mobile devices. Something that's really useful when doing mobile development, actually on all platforms, is the standard runtime library path functions. So these are on system IO utils. You can use the T path and you can get home path. So home path on Windows is going to be C:users username app data roaming. And this is your home path where you put data for your app or put all the users' data. Then you can also get things like the temporary folder, library folder, documents folder, shared documents, etc. There's a whole slew of these different directories that you can access. And you'll notice that each of these have a different location on different OS. So instead of saying, hard coding in, oh, I want to go into this particular folder, instead you use the get home path or get public path or get cache path or get temp path or whatever it is in order to find the path. And then that will change depending on which platform you're on. So that way you're not going to be platform specific. You're not going to be hard coded to a specific platform. All right, so let's prototype a mobile app on Windows. Basically, we're not going to follow a mobile tutorial exactly, but we're going to do some of the basic functionality that's in one of the mobile tutorials, try to make something kind of interesting, and then we'll talk about some of the difference between mobile and desktop some more, and then we'll move our mobile app, our app we've prototyped on Windows, to mobile platform. So this is the app we're going to build here. It's basically my own version of Instagram, although it does not have any sharing at this point, although that would be easy enough to add once we get into the mobile platform. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the camera component to take a picture, and we're going to let the user select filters and apply a filter to that picture. I made it so you could select multiple filters, but it might make more sense. Most of the filters don't look good mixed together, so maybe you might do it where you just select an individual filter. I am using a checklist here, checklist. That's not really a valid paradigm on mobile. Serena DuPont has some excellent sessions from Code Rage that talk about mobile design patterns. So I recommend you look at some mobile apps on your mobile devices and think about mobile devices and look at her sessions that she's put together on mobile design paradigms in order to design a UI that looks good. It takes a little bit more effort, but it's worth it, especially if you're going on Apple, because Apple has very strict standards about what can be approved in the Apple App Store.
So let's build our prototype our app here on Windows. So I'm going to do this kind of in a landscape mode here, because I'm going to do a camera app, and usually, when someone's holding their camera, I want them to hold it landscaped when they're taking the picture instead of portrait. So I'm going to form this like this. So I could get the exact size of the platform I'm going for, but I'll rely on the alignments and anchors in order to have the UI stretch as necessary. So right here is the, client height and client width, so I could get, if I knew what resolution I was going for, I could just adjust this until that was the logical pixel resolution of the platform I was targeting, of the device I was targeting. Now, one thing that's cool is when you're on the professional version, you can actually come in here and view it on different platforms, and then also create variant layouts, which I'll show you once we get over there, so that you can lay it out differently on different platforms. And then it has a the multi-device preview over here, you can preview it on all the different devices. But since we're not on mobile, they're not available for us here. I guess in theory I could preview it on Surface Pro and Windows Desktop, but there's not going to be very much difference there. Okay, so we're going to start out, we're going to put down a layout, and I'm going to use a layout, regular layout. I'm going to align that to the top, and then we're going to do an image. Let's do it this way. Image. And let's do a list box. Alright, now my list box, align that to the right. Make that a little smaller. And then my image, I'll align this to client. Helps to spell right. Okay, now on my layout up here, I'm going to put down a switch. And this switch is what the user is going to use to activate the camera. And we're going to align that to center. I guess I could put this over the image if I wanted to, but I'm not going to do that. And so now, to take a camera, take a picture, I need the camera component. Camera component. Now there's the T camera, which is used in 3D, which I showed you the other day. We're going to use the T camera component, which is what you use to actually take a picture. There it is. It's got an image of a camera. And let's see, on the switch, let's put some code here on this guy. Just want to do it on click. And say camera dot active equals switch one dot is checked. All right, and then we have to get the image from the camera and put it on the key image here. And so we do this on the on sample buffer ready event. And what I'm going to do here is something it's important to understand is the image is coming in a different thread than the UI thread. And you can only update your UI from the UI thread. So we need to put the image into the UI thread. And so I'm going to do that here with a tthread.synchronize. And we just say nil because we want the main thread. And I'm going to get the camera. Actually, we'll do a anonymous method here. Procedure begin. And here I'll say camera component. So I spell it correctly. One dot sample buffer to bitmap. And we're going to take the sample buffer and we're going to put it in image one dot bitmap. And we're going to tell it to resizes to fit. All right, so that's it. At this point, we're going to be able to create an image or take a picture with the camera. So let's run this and see. Kind of cool. I can do that easily, right? So let's turn this on. And look at that. Wearing my headphones kind of goofy. I'm looking at the screen on the left here because I got two monitors set up. But there's my camera right there. Hello. I have a halo. Ta-da. Okay, cool. Okay. So now, let's add some effects. I'm going to save this because it's always a good idea to save your work. So let's put some effects down here. So I'm going to go here and I want to put down a Gaussian blur. Now I want to put the list of effects in that list box. So I'm going to do a little code here on create. So that's going to go through all of the components on the image. And if it's an effect, then we're going to get a reference to that effect, add it to the list box, and set the effect enabled to false. And so in our list box here, we want to show checkboxes because I'm going to allow multiple to be enabled, and then on change check, we're going to do this. So that's going to get a reference to the item in the list box. that is select that the user changes, and then if the item is checked, or it enables it based on whether it's checked or not. All right, so if this worked, let's save it again. Turn on the camera. There I am with my halo, and let's turn on the tune effect. Woohoo! It worked. Waves. So I should be able to do tune and invert. Oh no, you can't do multiples. I've done multiples before. It's just certain ones don't work. Invert. Tyler? Nope. Huh. Certain ones just take precedence, apparently. Interesting. Alright, so apparently the effect to be able to do multiples wasn't necessary, but anyway. There is our little simple Instagram clone, if you will.
Platform services is a really great new feature available. It came in a few versions ago for FireMonkey that lets you find out what is supported on one platform and not on other platforms. So because of the fact that you can target multiple platforms now, you need to be aware of what features those different platforms support. So you can just there's two methods you're going to use with this. You're going to use supports platform service and get platform service. Supports platform service interrogates to say, hey, does this platform support this specific service? And you can actually optionally have it give you back a reference to that. If you don't, then you can use the get platform service to get a specific platform service, give you a reference to that platform service so that you can then interact with it. You can actually create your own built-in, you can use the built-in platform services or create your own as well. Lots of information in the doc wiki for you there. Here's a partial list of platform services. There's a lot here. So for example, you see in the FMX advertising, we have advertising services. So to see if the platform has advertising, which is on, we have mobile advertising support. I don't think we have desktop advertising support, but in the future we could certainly add that. Clipboard is available across all the platforms, but it's a little different on some platforms versus others. It's conceivable we might have other platforms in the future that don't have clipboard support. In-app purchase, maps. So I believe the maps only work on iOS and Android right now because of the Apple Maps and Google Maps require specific licensing to use those. Let's see, where else? Menus. So menus are not available on all platforms. You don't have the concept of a main menu on iOS device, for example. Phone dialer, that's a feature, I believe it's specific to Android, that you can dial the phone specifically or create your own phone dialer so that the user can dial the phone. Virtual keyboard, web browser. Here's some more. These are all the platform services. So for example, here's clipboard services, context service, dialogue, screen service. Do you have a screen? You know, these are things you would think, of course I have a screen, but when you start to consider the wide variety of platforms that are out there, you could be running on a device that doesn't have a screen at some point. So here's a code example of how you would use the platform services to access the clipboard. So you'd say if tplatformservices.current, so that's the current platform services, supports platform service, and we tell the interface here, which is IFMX extended clipboard service. And then we give it, in this case, we want to get an instance back. So we give it a reference to that interface. Then we'll use that reference we got back because we know it supports it since we said if. Then we're going to say clipboard service.set text. So you can set text, you can get text. Those are typical things you'll do with the clipboard service. So occasionally, you're going to have instances where you're going to use conditional defines. Now, generally speaking, with FireMonkey, you can use 90+% of your code across all platforms. But sometimes you want to reach down and grab APIs. And that's one thing I love about Delphi is it gives you this high-level layer with the common libraries and components where we can write a little bit of code and use these components and get a lot done and be really, really productive. But sometimes you want to reach down and grab those APIs that are specific to certain platforms. For example, Android has NFC, and if you want to write some code that's specific to Android and using NFC, you can do that in Delphi, but you can't compile it on iOS because Apple won't let you touch the NFC. At least not right now, they might in the future. So that's when you would use conditional defines, when you have code that's specific to certain platforms, because it won't compile. So there's 7 different compilers to consider. On Windows, we have the 32-bit and 64-bit. On OS X, we have a 32-bit compiler. On iOS, there's a 32-bit and 64-bit, and the simulator has its own compiler because it's not ARM, it's x86, which is kind of interesting. Most people don't realize that. And then Android has one compiler for ARM, but it actually works on the x86 Atom processors as well via libhoudini, although now Intel has end-of-lifed their Atom processor. I don't know if they've officially end-of-lifed it, but they're not really supporting it anymore, so we're not going to see many more of those Atom processors. So one thing about conditional defines, you can use if, defs, and ifs, compiler directives, to optionally compile code for selected branches of your code for certain CPUs, certain platforms, certain architectures. What this does is when you compile it for Android, it only compiles code for Android. And then we compile it for iOS, that Android code's excluded, all the common code, and then if there's any code that's specific for iOS is compiled for iOS. So this creates different sets of code for each platform. So this is, like I said, useful for linking when you're linking against platform-specific API calls. You want to be careful with how you do this because overuse of this can introduce a lot of complexity to your code. Generally speaking, you only want to do conditional defines in what I call library code, which is code that's not specific to the functionality of your application, right? So if you're creating a point of sale system, you don't want to have conditional defines in your point of sale code, but you might have conditional defines in the code that accesses your barcode scanner. All right, because on certain platforms, you might interface with that barcode scanner differently, but you don't want to have those conditional defines peppered throughout your point of sale code, your business code, your logic code. Here are some of the conditional defines you can use to target specifically where you're wanting to go. So, see, you have different CPUs here: ARM CPUs, x86 CPUs, x64 CPUs. 32-bit CPUs versus 64-bit CPUs. Here you can say, is it iOS? Is it Windows, Win32, Win64, macOS, Android? Next gen, this is our next generation compiler. Right now it's only on the mobile platforms. And then whether or not the platform supports inline assembler. So currently inline assembler is only available on the x86 platforms, which, because, otherwise you'd have to be writing ARM assembler and then that would be different. So anyway, that's kind of the list there, so you can see how you can slice this up in order to target things interesting. A couple things I'll point out. iOS is actually a derivative of macOS. So you'll notice macOS says true for OS X as well as iOS here. So there's kind of an interesting nuance of the iOS. And that's how Apple defines it. Apple defines iOS as a derivative of macOS. Or now OS X, I guess. What are they calling it? They changed the name of it. It's Mac OS and iOS are the two different OSs. So here's a list of predefined conditionals, and you can also have user-defined conditionals. So that's something else to consider as well. So I kind of alluded to this earlier, but generally your best usage strategies are to use the platform services when possible. All right. That way you're not having different code compiled for different things, because platform services allow you to interrogate that platform and then get back those references as you need them. But when you do need to use conditional define or compiler directives, do that in library code. And generally you're not going to put iOS and Android code in the same unit. For example, you're going to have one unit that implements the iOS version and one unit that implements the Android version. Here are some links for more information. Once you upgrade to Pro with mobile or enterprise, the great thing is you have the source code so you can see how all this is done in the FireMonkey and the Runtime library. And it's all, actually in the Runtime library, will see it combines the Android code and iOS code in the same unit just because of the nature of that. But in FireMonkey, you will see that there is actually, here's some examples here. in FireMonkey fmx.memo, you can see that there is a fmx.memo.ios and fmx.memo.win. So what this does is fmx.memo implements interfaces and base classes and common behaviors, and then uses if-defs in the uses statement for platform-specific implementations. All right. So there is fmx.memo defines the base classes and interfaces, but then in its uses statement, either uses fmx.memo.ios or fmx.memo.win, etc., in order to select which implementation is used. All right. So all the iOS specific code is in one unit, all the Windows specific code is in another unit. And there's some other examples for you to look at as well. So let's talk about some of the differences between the compiler between mobile and desktop. That link there, bit.ly, it should be EMBT. I'm sorry, I apparently copied it from the long, short URL. Moving to mobile, do bit.ly/moving to mobile, and that will give you a great DocWiki article that walks through a lot of this stuff I'm going to talk to you about the differences between the desktop compiler and the mobile compiler. So one of the things that's changed is the types. So strings are zero based on mobile compilers. They're immutable as well. This has to do with the way strings work on that OS, and also because of the fact that we moved to a next-gen compiler. We have a different backend compiler, and just for compatibility's sake, and optimization and such, there were some changes to some of the types. And so strings are now zero based. So if you were using system.widestring, now you'd be using system.string, or if you're building a application from scratch in Starter Edition, specifically as target mobile, then you're just going to use system.string. System.string is a Unicode string. It's a great string. It's really the only string you need for most situations. You don't want to use ANSI string or short string or p-ANSI string or p-ANSI char or p-wide char. Those are pointers to strings. Instead, you would use the TString Builder, system.string, or marshaled string. Open string and ANSI string and short string, can't use those at all anymore. So instead, you would eliminate those, and possibly in those situations, you want to use an array of bytes, which is probably what you're trying to do anyway. Like I said, generally speaking, you're just going to use system.string for most all of your string needs. Now, if you are wanting to work with that string, manipulate that string, then you'll want to use the new TString Helper. So if you've used Pascal or Delphi previously, you may have used system.pause for position of something, system.delete, system.copy to work with your strings. Those are specifically for one-base strings, but the new TString Helper function is designed to work with either zero-base string or one-base string. So the desktop compiler is one-base string, the mobile compiler is zero-base string. So by using TString Helper.indexOf, then it will give you back the index correctly understanding if it's a zero-base string or one-base string. So if you just use TString Helper, you don't have to worry about whether or not it's a zero-base string or one-base string. You can use system.low and system.high in order to get the first and last indexes of the string as well. There's way more methods to TString.helper, and you can get to it there from that short bit.ly link, and it will show you all of those. And there's tons of them out there. It makes working with strings so much easier. Now, as I mentioned before, mobile strings are immutable, which means you don't want to change them. You can, if you do try and modify the middle of a string, it'll generate a compiler warning now. In the future, it may be disabled. Right now, it just gives you a compiler warning. It handles it for you behind the scenes. But for performance reasons, it's not going to be very performant. So you really want to use the new TString Builder to work with parts of a string. And it's a big buffer that you can move things around, and then you can later just call toString, and it gives you back an immutable string. It's got lots of methods on it, like append, copy to, insert, remove, and replace, that let you deal with the parts of the string. Now let's talk about memory management. On the desktop, if you create it, you free it. So here's an example. We right there say my object equals t my simple class dot create. We've created an instance of that. We've allocated memory. That object now exists. We can do something with that object. And then when we're done, we're going to call my object dot free. So this is a common pattern here where you have the try finally. So if something happens while you're using the object, if an exception's raised, then it'll always catch that and call the my object dot free before the exception bubbles up to the user or to be handled elsewhere. So this way we know that free is always called so we don't leak memory. This is the common use case scenario on the desktop. The mobile compilers use automatic reference counting, or ARC. So this automatically tracks references to objects. When a reference goes out of scope, it decrements a counter. When all the references are removed, then when there are no more references, then it automatically frees the memory and calls the destructor. So some people say this is like garbage collection, which you see in .NET and Java, but it's actually way better because it's deterministic and it's got better performance. But what I mean by being deterministic is that with the garbage collector, once it goes out of once you are no longer using it, at some point in the future, the garbage collector runs in a separate process. It pauses your execution and goes through and cleans up all the references to reclaim the memory. So what that means is you could, your application pauses at some unexpected point. You don't know when that's going to happen. You can't control it. You have no way to control the garbage collection. Sometimes there are methods to do that, but they're always discouraged because they could change it behind the scenes because the garbage collector is really its own process. And so your app could pause unexpectedly. It doesn't perform very well on mobile devices because they have less memory and less CPU power. And you don't know when your memory is going to be freed or your destructor is going to be called. In some cases, garbage collection, you have to manually call destructors because the destructor may never be called by the garbage collector. Anyway, garbage collectors are not as good as ARC. ARC is much, much better. And we've actually been using ARC for years with strings and interfaces in Delphi. And now on the mobile compiler, it's being applied to all objects. So here's how you would do that same thing we looked earlier. Actually, I should have renamed it, not try finally. Let's see, it says, oops, let's see, back up. It says my simple class try finally. That shouldn't be called try finally. Anyway, you're going to say my object, you're going to create it and then do something with it, and you don't have to call free. As soon as your reference went out of scope there at the end, the memory is freed, the destructor is called. I copied the slide and I didn't change all the text. So that's why it says if you create it, you free it. You don't need to free it. It's freed automatically by the ARC memory manager. So if you want to explicitly free it, you can do this where you assign the reference to nil. And what that does is it decrements the reference counter and says there's no longer reference to it because in this case that was the only reference. It's freed right there. So you can free it immediately. This is really, really important to understand because ARC is deterministic. You are still in control as the programmer. You can choose to pool objects, you can choose when to free them, etc. You don't have to you don't have to be dependent on the memory manager, the garbage collector. You are in control. And that's really important differentiation from ARC and garbage collection. So if you want to manually call your destructor, you can do that by calling dispose of. And dispose of is actually compatible between both the desktop compiler and the mobile compiler. And so what dispose of does is it will call free on the desktop or just call the destructor on the mobile compiler. So on the desktop, it will free the memory, but on the mobile compiler, it just calls the destructor. So the example of when you might want to do that is, let's say your object has some sort of unmanaged resource like a file handle or a database access handle or something like that. And in those cases, you need to call the dispose of. Now, because ARC automatically calls the destructor when it frees the memory, you don't have to call dispose of, but you can call dispose of to free it right away. So in this case, you call dispose of, and that calls the destructor there in the finally block, and then when the reference goes out of scope, that is when your memory is freed. A little more about Arc. It supports weak references to prevent circular references. So if you have two objects that reference each other, because they'll always be referencing each other, you get circular references and they won't ever go away. But you can use a weak reference in order to say, if this is the only reference, don't count it. There's more information on that in the doc wiki. You can use unsafe as well when you don't want to have, or when you want disable counting of references. That's discouraged. You don't want to do that typically unless you know why and there's a specific reason you're doing that. One interesting effect about Arc, though, is it does allow operator overloading on classes. So previously you could only use operator overloading on record types, but now you're available to you on classes. Arc is preferred by Apple for mobile development because it has a huge performance benefit on mobile devices over garbage collection, and it prevents memory leaks. Well, you can always write bad code, I guess, that I call them memory bubbles instead of memory leaks, because the classic example, and this happens with garbage collection as well as with automatic reference counting, is let's say you have a collection of references to an object. So you're creating these objects and you're throwing them in this collection, into this bag or list or whatever it is, some sort of collection of objects. And you flag those objects as being deleted. And so you no longer use them anymore, but they're still in that bag. And if they're still in that list, if they still have references to them, then it will act like a memory leak. It will continue to consume more and more and more memory. So you can waste memory. You can cause problems even with Arc, but Arc makes it really easy to do it right and not do that. So Arc is great. So let's talk about deploying to mobile. Something that was new introduced is the deployment manager. The deployment manager actually works on Windows and and Mac OS as well, but it's really important when deploying to mobile, iOS and Android. And so what it does is, on iOS and Android and Mac OS, you create this app bundle that has all of the pieces in it that you need for your app. And so this allows you to put things in the correct folders. So for example, you see here we have launcher icons and stuff like that, and it specifies where they go on the remote path. So for example, let's say you wanted to add in a database into your app or add in some additional data files. You would add those through the deployment manager to make sure they're in the right path. And once they're in the right path, then when you deploy it onto iOS or on Android, it pushes that through with it, and then you can then access it from your app. Now, remember I talked about those T-path to give you access to common paths? This is where you do it. So, for example, right here, down here where it says I don't have a mouse, .assets/internal, that is the path to the home path on Android, if I remember correctly. So check out that documentation on T-path for the common paths and make sure you set it up correctly in here so that your files are where you expect them to be on iOS and Android. Also on Android, it's important that you set permissions. You need to specify permissions for whatever your app will do on Android. So common permissions, for example, are accessing the camera, accessing the internet. Pretty much every app anymore accesses the internet. So you need to make sure that you set those permissions. The most common permissions are actually set by default when you create a new app for Android, but you'll probably want to come in and manage those. For example, the phone dialer, I think, is set by default, which some people are like, why do you set the phone dialer? But if the phone dialer is set, then it gives your app the ability to respond to incoming calls. The problem is that when you put it in the App Store, it'll say, hey, this app uses the phone dialer, so it won't let you deploy it to tablets because tablets don't have a phone dialer, and it also warns users that it may cost them money. Well, you're probably not going to ever call, so this is something you might want to go in there and manage what permissions you're using. There's documentation in Google's Android documentation that tells you which these permissions do and when you're going to need them. But if you're doing something like trying to access the camera or T-camera component and your app doesn't work, you might need to go and check your permissions. All right, so that's important to understand. It's available through the project options. You can go in and change the permissions. So some basics of getting started for iOS development. You have to use PA Server. PA Server is a program you run on Windows, or I'm sorry, you run on your Mac that lets you deploy from your Windows-based IDE to Mac OS or to iOS. It connects across the network. PA Server can be running on your local machine. So in my instance here, I have a MacBook Pro and my Windows is running in a virtual machine. And so the virtual machine talks to PA Server on the host machine and the IDE pushes it through to the host machine to run it there. You could use, for example, a Mac Mini. It's a real common situation. People have a nice laptop already and they don't want to go to a MacBook Pro. They'll get a Mac Mini for a few $100s and connect across the network to that to push for Mac OS testing or iOS testing. You can also use a service like Mac and Cloud, where you have a cloud-hosted Mac and connect to there and push it across the internet. It'll take a little bit longer because you're going across the internet instead of a local network, but it's fully supported and you can do that. Also, for dealing with Android devices, you have to have the Android USB drivers and set up your Android device for debugging purposes. We have lots of documentation in the doc wiki, as well as some videos on getting started available for you at that URL there. So let's look at loading our prototyped app into Professional and deploying it to iOS and Android, and then also how to debug on mobile. So this is my mobile camera app that I just saved on a starter edition, and now I'm loading it up into the full version here. So we're going to run it real quick and make sure it still works. No changes have been made at this point. There I am in monochrome or tune. I gotta get my halo on just right. Ta-da! Inverse looks kind of crazy. Oh, let's see. Not Tyler, inverse. There we go. Now it's a dark halo. All right, too much fun. So I'm going to come over here to target platforms, and I have no target platforms here. So I can right click on this and say add platform. And let's start with just adding OS 10, Mac OS. Okay, so now I got to make sure it's going to connect. Now it's already got my host file set up here, but let's check and make sure. Here's PA Server running. I'm going to hit I and 10.0.1.4, 10.0.11.4. See, that's not, oh, that's Mac OS. Mac OS 11.4. Let's make sure this is correct. Properties, 10.0.1.4. Okay, so this should work now. If I hit run, this should build it now and run it, deploy it to Mac OS. So put it on the wrong screen, but I'll drag it over here. Hit the switch. Oh my goodness, look at this. I have built a cross-platform. Let's see, what should I go with? Wave. Wave effect. Woohoo! Whoa, I'm all wavy. All right, having too much fun with this. So there we go. I've built a Mac OS version of my application. So let's go ahead and add platform again. And this time we'll add Android. It's already set up here to with the Android SDK. This gets all installed automatically when I install it. The Android SDK does. You have to set up these manually. Those videos show you how the doc wiki explains all this. But if you do change your Android SDK, for example, if you upgrade a new version of it, you might need to come in here and make sure these paths are set correctly for the SDK, the NDK, and Java. What I'll do, so example like zip-align, if you change versions of the Android SDK, will change locations. So I'll just come in here and I'll go up a couple levels and just do search for zip-align, find it, select it, and you're good to go. It'll put a little triangle next to them if they're not set up correctly. So let's go to project options, and we're on Android. So let's see, application, uses permissions. There we go. So right here, see this camera component is false. So let's go ahead and run this now. Plug in my Android device, my Nexus 5. So Nexus 5 appears, it shows up here at the top as a device. If you have multiple Androids connected, you can click this drop down to select, hit refresh if it's not in the list. Now I have, go to device manager here, Android device. The USB driver is loaded for it. If I didn't have a USB driver, this wouldn't be here. Also, you can check it by going to command prompt. And if you have this on your path, which I recommend if you're doing much Android development you do, see there is my Android device there. So ADB Android debug bridge, very useful when messing with Android. We could do a whole boot camp just on using the Android debug bridge, but we're not going to do that today. So there we go. I've got my Android device connected. So let's go ahead and run it on here. So I hit build and I get an exception here down the build error. No resource found that matches a given name, splash image. So if we come in here and look at this, project options, application, oh my goodness, all of my artwork is missing. Now the reason this is missing is because it was, the project was originally created in Starter, and Starter doesn't populate this. So what you can do is I created a default Android option set. So you create a new, okay, there's two ways to deal with this. One way would be create a whole new project and move this unit, the only place I had any code, into that new project. And it would have everything set up correctly in the project file. The other way is to take a project, a new project, and save all your artwork off, which is what I've done. And then, let's see, I want to say, oops. All Android configurations apply and load up this option set that I previously saved off. And now all the artwork's there. I guess the other way would be to come in and manually select the artwork you want to use. Because chances are when you're going into the App Store, you're not want to use the default artwork. Okay. So there we go. All the artwork is set now. So I messed with this for a while and it ended up not working. So I'm just going to show you how I ended up figuring out getting it to work, and you could ignore the rest of this. This is the better way to do it. Okay, so that didn't work. I expected that to work. So let's do the option 2. Remember I talked about the second option? Add new project, multi-device app, blank application, and, oh, I did a C++ app. Add new project, Delphi project, multi-device, blank application. Okay, so remove from project. Yes. And then add desktop mobile camera. All right, and so we're going to remove this. Remove project. And then we'll save this as mCamera 2. All right, and so now by doing that, it's going to have everything set up correctly for mobile development. So now, in theory, this should deploy and run correctly on my Android device. So I told you I was going to show you a little bit about mobile debugging. ADB is really useful for Android. So it's installing now. So let's take a look at it on here with Reflector. And hopefully we don't get the same error. There we go. Okay. No errors. So we'll turn this sideways and we'll enable that camera. There we go. There's the cameras enabled. And we can do the wave effect. Woo! So I could turn around. Oops, I turned off the screen. So now you can see me with the wave effect. All right. So there we go. Now we deployed it to Android and had some fun with it on there. So, okay, that was that. Let's say that's the best practice. Then you're going to create a whole new project and move your source code files over. I probably could figure out what's wrong. I probably just did something silly before, but this is probably easier and less likely to have problems. So we did it on Mac OS, we did Android. Actually, my iOS, there's documentation and videos on iOS. My developer account on iOS has lapsed and I have not bothered to renew it. I really should, but it's going to be the same. I will show you a few things though while we're in here that are kind of cool. So I mentioned before, you can do this drop down. See, I have a lot more options available to me. So we can do the multi-device preview, and let's say, what will this look like on? Can I do this in? There we go. On Android and iPhone, I could do these. Landscape. Interesting. So it only does portrait mode. I didn't know that, but so I can see. I'll make this even bigger though, so you can see what this looks like on iOS. So you got the iOS switch versus the Android switch. A little bit different, right? So you can do that. You can preview it on multiple devices here, right? So I can see what it would look like on my Sony smartwatch, right? Whatever device you want. This is actually an extensible list. And you can also come over here and just say, what style? Let's preview this on Android, preview this on OS 10, preview it on iOS from here. And then you can say, you know what? I want to change it. I wanted to make a variation of this. So when it's on Google Glass, you know what? It doesn't really make sense to select this. So we're just going to take this guy here and say visibles false. So we're going to get rid of that list there. So on Google Glass, we don't have the list. Okay. So the cool thing is it actually automatically adds it over here for me because I have a variation of it now for Google Glass. So there's Google Glass version. And so what this has done is it's created a variation of the layout that actually I'll just show you here in the code file. So we have a second fmx file that contains the difference between these two. And so this one just says that list box is not visible now. Okay, so that's really cool. You can create these variations so you can create the UI that's going to look best on all the different platforms. So actually, let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to make a share button on here. Let's put that button on the layout up here at the top. And I'm going to say align this to the left. And I could put margins around it to make it look nicer, but I'm not going to, just for right now. And I'm going to assign this to an action. I put an action manager down there. Action list. There we go. Now, a new standard action, media library, and show share sheet action. All right, and then the text we're going to put on here is share. And oh, I got not in there. So then on the action itself, so come here to action, expand it out. It has an event on it. On before execute. And we're going to say show share sheet action dot bitmap dot assign image one dot bitmap. All right. Now, if I've done this correctly, this should give us the ability to share that image that we've just modified here. If not, then I'll show you some more mobile debugging, as it were, right? Okay, so let's turn on my camera. And there's my slide. And let's put the wave effect on it, right? And then hit share. Oh, look at that. That is so cool. So, see, look at that. We have support for receiving intents, which is cool Android stuff. So let's go ahead and send it through. I will tweet it, right? And yes, we got to allow Twitter access to the picture. And now, we'll turn it sideways so you can see it. So look at that. We are composing a tweet with the image there. That was what? A couple, one line of code and a component and some properties. And now I've turned my, hold on. Oh, okay. I have to do, okay, I see what I did. So see, it doesn't have the effect on it. We can fix that. We have the technology. We can make him better. All right, so let's go back into our app. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say image instead of getting the bitmap, because the bitmap is the original image. Instead, we're going to say make screenshot. All right, and this will get the image with the effect applied to it. It's going to be so cool. We're cloning Instagram here, people. Okay, so here's the app. It's up. Turn the camera on. And you know what? Actually, I could set a property on the camera component to let it turn around. But well, I can't do that. I got to turn the effect on. I can't see what I'm doing. There's a property on the camera component. I want to do the wave effect. I'll just do this. To use the reverse camera. So I could add another switch for that to switch camera directions. But yeah, this is enough for now. All right, so we're going to tweet this. And now, there we go. I'm not sure what happened the first time. So there's my image with the wave effect applied to it. And we can tweet it out. This cool image was taken with my Delphi app. Boom. Tweet. All right. So I want to show you debugging really quick. It debugs just like it does on Windows. I'm going to go ahead and you have two buttons here, run without debugging and run regular run, which runs with debugging. One note is you want to make sure build configuration is set to debug. Otherwise, it won't make any difference. And I just set a breakpoint and I hit build and run, regular run with debugging. Okay, so here it is running on my phone, and I'm going to tap the switch. And there's my breakpoint. I can come in here and inspect is checked as true. And so it's just like regular debugging, but watch this. This is so cool. View, where's debug windows? CPU windows, disassembly. That is ARM assembly code. I can actually view this. That's so cool. This is the ARM disassembly code. You can step through here. You can go into the registers, all the stuff you would expect to do with a debugger on a mobile device. Now let's look at the REST client. There's a lot of features I love in Delphi, but this is one of the ones that just is one of my favorites. And I'll share a little story here. I was down in Brazil and I was talking to this guy that ran a big .NET development shop, and his boss wanted him to build a mobile app. And he's like, well, okay, we're .NET developers, we know C#, we should use Xamarin. And so he went and looked at Xamarin and said, okay, I'm going to build a little simple app with Xamarin just to kind of get my feet wet. And I'm going to build a little REST client application, and it should take me about a week. He said, figured a week would be a good, for him to learn how to do it and build his app and deploy it. And he was into it a week, and he said this is taking him a lot longer than he expected. It was really frustrating, and he wasn't making much progress. And I said, I bet you I can build a REST client app in 5 minutes. And he's like, no. And I said, yep, I can do it right here, and I'll deploy it to your phone in 5 minutes. And sure enough, we were able to do that and deploy it to his phone. Luckily, he had an Android phone. iOS phones, Apple makes it a little complicated for deploying to a new phone. But anyway, was able to build a REST client, connect to a REST service, pull down some data, display it to the user, and deploy it to all his phone within 5 minutes. Actually, I think it might have been just barely over 5 minutes, but still pretty close. He was really impressed. The REST client in Delphi is just phenomenal. This is a feature only available in Pro and higher. but I'm going to show you some cool stuff you can do with it. So let's talk about REST really quick. REST gives you access to REST and JSON-based web services and cloud services. Actually, I think it works with XML as well, but there's not a lot of XML-based services out there. There's over 50,000 public services, though. Twitter, Dropbox, Google, everybody anymore uses REST-based services. A while back, everybody was doing SOAP-based services, but SOAP was just too complicated, SOAP web services, and REST is a lot simpler, it's a lot lighter weight, and it's a lot more common today. There's a URL there for a programmable web directory, which is just a list of web services. There's also private services out there, for example, .NET, Windows Communication Foundation, OData, Java, JAX, RS, Jersey, etc. Lots of technologies are used inside firewalls to build REST services for service-oriented architectures and stuff like that, where within your corporation, you're talking to these REST services and not even going outside your corporate firewall. So you can use the REST and JSON client stack to expand the functionality of your desktop and mobile apps. And these components make it so easy. So the components, the stack that we have is made up of 3 parts. There's the REST components themselves, which I'll show you here in a second. And then we also include REST demos, which is a collection of demos that shows how to connect to things like Google, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And just a bunch of demos all put together into one application with source code. And then there's the REST debugger. The REST debugger is a really cool tool that you can use to rapidly prototype, and build ad hoc requests. So you can test REST services, prototype REST services. And then the cool thing is you can actually copy those components from the REST debugger into your application and build your application really quick, like I said, in 5 minutes. So here's the REST components that are available, the REST client components. The TREST client is the main component. It's what you're going to use to connect out. You make a request. You can have multiple requests all using the same REST client. The REST client defines the endpoint. The requests are specific requests being made against that endpoint. Each request is going to get a response back. And then you can take that response and use which is in JSON, and use the REST response dataset adapter to convert that JSON response into a data set. That's a really cool feature. So you can go out there and grab a collection of data from a REST service, put it in a data set into a grid, display it to your user. Really cool stuff. If your REST service requires authentication, we have 4 different authentication components: simple authentication, HTTP basic authenticator, OAuth 1, and OAuth 2. With these components, you can really, I think I've seen a couple that were like using some sort of weird implementation of authentication, but eventually we got there. One thing about REST is it's not a standard. It's not a protocol. It's kind of a concept, if you will. So everybody implements it a little bit differently. So you really need to go out and look at the documentation for how the individual REST service is implemented in order to connect to it and authenticate it with it correctly. There's also some libraries for dealing with JSON, parsing and formatting JSON. There's a JSON to object and a T-object to JSON adapters that are out there. So you can actually just take an object, serialize it to JSON, or bring it back. It's like a line of code to go each direction. It's really cool for sending stuff as JSON. JSON is a JavaScript object notation. So if you're familiar with XML, JSON's like the lighter weight brother of XML. XML's really strict, JSON's really loose. It uses curly braces, whereas XML uses the angle brackets. And it works with the live bindings and design time execution for rapid prototyping. For more information on the REST client library, check out the Code Rage 8 videos there. Actually, there's some Code Rage 9 and Code Rage X videos also on it, but these were the first ones right when it was introduced. Some good information in there. And there's also a link there for the doc wiki and some samples. And there's the samples for the REST demo, and then you can also take a look at the source code for the REST client. So there's actually another video I did where I actually built a REST client in 5 minutes and deployed it to iOS, Android, and ran it on Windows as well. I'm not going to do that right now, but I will show you some stuff with REST client. So this is the REST debugger. I'm going to come in here, and I have a URL already on my clipboard that's for Stack Exchange API. And this just says I want to get items tagged Delphi from Stack Overflow. Hit send request. Now, one thing is that this actually came back as compressed data, but this automatically is able to decompress it for us. So here's the JSON data, and I'm going to say I want the items property, items root element. So if you see right here, it says items, that's the root element, and that's the root element I want to have. And so it just dives into the JSON for me there, and go here to tabular data. So there we go. This is giving me all the data in a data set adapter. So let's put it into a grid, into a data set, into a grid for me. And I can take a look at, here's the titles of these questions. All right. Very cool. That was really simple, right? So now what's cool is I can actually take this. Let's go ahead and do this. And I'll hit copy components. And what that's done is it's copied to the clipboard the components that I need to make that request that I just put out there. Now, one thing I'll point out is that this is a really simple request I just did here, but I can actually add parameters to it. If I needed to have parameters that were, URL segments or header or body, whatever, I can add authentication to it, OAuth, simple basic OAuth 2, and define proxy settings. So even though this is a really simple, what I'm doing here, this supports a lot more than that. So let's close this out and let's go ahead and make a new multi-device application. And I hit paste, and there are all the components I need to connect to complete that request. So here's the REST client. The REST client specifies the endpoint right here, base URL. Technically, this should be chopped off right here, and that the question order should be on the request, but it's flexible. You can do it either way you want to. So this is the request that's going to make that request through the client. Here's the response. So the request is going to connect to that response and put the response in here. So if I go look at the request, see it connects to that client. And here's it connects to the response. And so that's how it puts the JSON into here. And then this is the REST response dataset adapter. So it points to that response and it grabs the JSON out of that response and puts it into the FDMEM table right here. So that the FDMEM table has the dataset representation of that request. So let's put down I'll do a list view. Just because you don't usually use grids on mobile and I want to deploy this to mobile. Client. Okay, so first thing I want to do is I'm going to execute this request. So I just right click on here and say execute, and execute that request. And now I'm going to say bind visually. And so here is the FDMEM table that has all that data in it. And I want to bind this to the list view. So I say sync. So this is visual live bindings, which is a really cool technology as well. There's so many cool technologies in here. There we go. Let's spread those out so they can see what I'm doing. So this visual live bindings connects connect those together. And I want to put the title, there's title right there, in the item text. All right, so here is the list of all the titles of those items there. Why does it keep moving that around? And I also want to put in that's it. All right, so it's going to list all the titles of those. Now, I showed you how to change the accessory on here, but I'll go ahead and do that now real quick. Item, appearance, object, item, objects, accessories, visible. All right, so now the only thing I have to do is add a line of code on here on the form. We have to, on the, we'll do it on show. So it's a little bit later. And we'll say REST request dot execute. There we go. So let's run this on Windows. Boom! Look at that. We just created a REST client. Goes out and connects Stack Overflow, pulls down questions. And, just because we can, We're going to run it on Android. I haven't even saved my work yet. You could tell I can get a kick out of this. Now the permission for internet set automatically. Oh my goodness, look at that. I don't know. I don't know how long that took that time. I wasn't going for speed, but that's pretty cool. And like I said, this works with more complicated REST requests as well. FireDAC. This FireDAC is such an awesome, amazing data access framework. I love it so much. I've seen quotes, people saying how much FireDAC makes database development fun again. A little bit about FireDAC, or data access in general in Delphi. From Delphi's first version, data access has been a very important key feature of it. When it was originally introduced, it had the BDE. BDE was great because it made it really easy to connect to databases. It was database agnostic, if you will, in that you could drop down a BDE connection and a T-table and connect to any database pretty much and just point to a different database and pull data out, and it worked great. BDE was kind of ahead of its time, but pretty soon it got a little heavyweight. It became fragile, and it was a kind of complicated deployment. And eventually we kind of deprecated it and moved away from it, introduced some other data access frameworks. Now, those data access frameworks didn't have all the features of the BDE, but they were a lot lighter weight, a lot faster, a lot less fragile, and a lot easier to deploy. But they were unidirectional instead of bidirectional. They didn't have all the features and such like I mentioned before. But now we have FireDAC. So FireDAC harkens back to all the functionality and all the simplicity of the BDE, as far as you can still drop down a connection, point it to any database, drop down a table component, and pull data out of that connection and interact with that data bidirectionally. Okay, so it had all the features of the BDE, but then makes it lightweight and robust, and then adds a ton of other features to it. So first of all, works across all the platforms we support: iOS, Mac OS, Android, and Windows. It has components for in-memory data sets, local SQL. The local SQL is so cool. You can actually do joins across different data sets, and actually can be a non-FireDAC data set. So you can have a data set, a T-client data set, and interbase data set, and whatever kind of data set you want to do, and do local SQL joins across that. I actually did a join, an example with like 5 different data sets from 5 different databases and different data sources, like an Excel file and all sorts of stuff. And it was just so cool because it just worked, and it was able to do a join across all those data sets. Very cool. There's extract, transform, and load operations. So, for example, you can take data from an Excel spreadsheet and pump it into a database or between one database and another. Lots of cool stuff. Array DML, cached updates, auto increment fields. It's the cool thing is you can use a connection and point it to a different database, and your components can be database agnostic, but you can also unlock specific features for certain databases as well. So what databases does it support? I want to say all of them, but there probably are some it doesn't support. You see there's Access, Postgres, Oracle, Firebase, Interbase, IBM DB2, MongoDB, which is a NoSQL database. It's got really cool MongoDB support. If you're new to NoSQL databases, I got some documentation I've done with MongoDB. Very cool what you can do with that. But I want to point out real quick, over there on the left, you see DB Express and ODBC and DataSnap. Between DB Express and ODBC, if there is a database you can't connect to that's not in this list, you can use DB Express and ODBC to connect to it most likely and get there as well. So database, let's go ahead and make a new multi-device application. And I'm not going to do mobile deployment just for simplicity's sake, but I'll tell you what you need to do just because this is taking a long time. So go to the Data Explorer, go to FireDAC, and I could show you Interbase because, you expect Interbase to work. Let's try SQLite. And let's take the employees database, right? We're going to put employees database over here. And here's the connection component. Cool thing is connection component can work with any of these, right? So there's all the different connection definitions we have here, or you can specify it by driver. right there. MongoDB. I love MongoDB. I had so much fun with that. Check out the MongoDB demos. I'll show you links to that. And we hit test and test to it. Now, one thing is SQLite, if you point to a database that doesn't exist and say test, it says, yep, I can make a database there. So that doesn't really tell me anything. But I can do this. This is really cool. I can go to this tab here and I can say select star from employees and actually execute. Why can't I execute that? Oh, I'm in the wrong window. And execute that SQL statement. See this? I can execute SQL from the connection screen. That is really useful for making sure you're connected correctly, connected to the right place, or just want to go in and look at something real quick, or maybe you need to run a script to set up a database or something like that. So I can do it all from here. Lots of options that I can configure this for, and there's even a wizard walk you through the steps. All right, so I'm connected to there, and let's put down a table, a grid. And I'm going to use live bindings again. Live bindings are cool. And let's activate this guy. Active. There we go. And we'll just connect him to the grid. And look at that. Grid full of data. So there we go. SQLite. Now, I will show you how to do the deployment for mobile project. Come down here to deployment. This is the deployment manager. Now, if I was going to deploy this to Android, actually I have to save this off first. So it's not going to have the deployment here yet because I haven't actually built it for Android. Project, build, or right here I can just do it. Project manager. I don't have Android selected. I'm like, why is this not working? Now build. Okay, so now we have our deployment managers populated. So if I want to add a file, so my SQLite database, I just come here, find my SQLite database, and deploy it and make sure it's in the right path, which is going to be, actually, I'll show you the other way to find out. So if I want to add interbase support, here I just come in here and say interbase client, and, interbase to go, because this is mobile, Android, and it will deploy it. Now, these are my license files here. You have to have your license files installed, which the documentation tells you how to do that. And I check this, and it's gone and added those to the right locations. And then .assets.internal /assets/internal, that's the location you want to stick your interbase database in for interbase, or your SQLite database would go there. Those are the two databases that you can embed in your mobile application. Okay, and that's it. Once you've done that, then you're able to connect to it, and you want to change your path in your connection connection string. We have other videos and documentation that talks about that, but that's the basics of database connectivity. FireDAC is so cool. Check out some of the skill sprints. I'll show you links for those on FireDAC. For more information on FireDAC, we have a FireDAC skill sprint series, and those are some of the sessions we have in there. A lot of great information on FireDAC. Check it out. The local SQL one on there, down towards the bottom, in-memory datasets and local SQL. That's the one where I had fun and did this join across all these different datasets. So cool. Also, here's some more information on MongoDB, 2 different MongoDB sessions I did at Code Rage 10, and also some sessions for C++ Builder as well. And even more information on FireDAC. Lots of good information out there. I'll put all this in the blog post later on. And there is some DocWiki links for you. And with that, it's time for Q&A.
David, I here, and others are with me. Great questions have been coming in all throughout this morning's presentation. A couple questions about how to get mobile support if you've got the starter edition. I put the link to the shop site. There's a special promotion going on where you can upgrade from starter edition to pro and also the mobile pack for $0. So it's a great offer going on right now. Just go to the shop site, shop.embarcadero.com, and or the embarcadero.com/rad offer page. All the details are there. So if you have starter edition, if you already have pro but not mobile pack, you can purchase the mobile add-on pack. If you have Rad Studio, that includes the mobile add-on pack. Enterprise includes the mobile add-on pack as well. There was a question about what FireMonkey components are good for displaying large amounts of formatted text to smooth scrolling in a mobile app, apart from using WebView. T-List View is very good. It has inertia built in. It's a very lightweight control, T-List View. You just scroll through lots of data, and we've done tests on frame rates on different mobile devices, including older iPhones and Android phones, and it does smooth scrolling, and it also depends on how much you use your finger to scroll through the information. At the same time, if you've got a grid or a string grid and you've got lots of information you're trying to squeeze into a small smartphone space, you're going to have, those bits are going to have to get moved around. So, but I would check out T-List View for mobile in FireMonkey. Let's see. There's a question about migrating VCL forms. Someone had 400 to 500 forms. You could use the Meta converter to convert all of those forms and the underlying Delphi code, and it converts them to FireMonkey forms. And then you can take advantage of all the things that Jim showed on Wednesday in FireMonkey, the effects, the glow effects, animations, and all of those things to have a richer experience both on Windows as well as on multi-device. So if you want to have whatever, I think they were relating to what about WPF style, again, FireMonkey gives you all that richness for building user experience, and check out Wednesday where Jim showed a bunch of those kind of animations and effects that you can put on buttons, on edit boxes, and so on to call attention to the user interface. Check out a lot of the user experience UI blog posts and videos by Serena DuPont. She's been doing sessions at the most recent Code Rages on designing your applications for great UIs using FireMonkey. So that's another place to take a look at what you can do with FireMonkey across, again, on Windows only or on the other devices as Jim showed today. Same source code, just recompile your FireMonkey app, and then you've got it on Windows 32 and 64, Mac OS, iOS, and Android. Some people were talking about the replays that they were looking at having audio out of sync. Make sure you use the official playlist, which points to the replays. Don't use the live streams that were captured on Facebook or YouTube. Those had issues along the way. We just provided those for those people who were having problems using GoToWebinar's web interface to watch what was happening live. The replays are, 30 frames a second, synchronized and everything, and they're uploaded to YouTube day 1 through day 4. I put the URLs multiple places for the playlist, and we'll get day 5 up there later today or over the weekend as well. There was a question about Z-order on different components and different devices. For example, a web view or a T-web browser and so on. Certain platforms, the web browser component takes over the whole screen. On Android, that's the way it is. iOS, Z-order. So you can try using the T web browser component and see what's happening. And again, pay attention to the Z-order when you're doing your layouts and using panels and so on. For certain native controls, like on iOS, the tedit and tmemo, I believe, then you can have some z-order control there. But I'll check again on the on what happens with web browser. I think it's on Android. It takes full screen, and on iOS, it should do the z-order correctly. There was a question about Windows tablets. If Windows tablet is running Windows 10 and is running an Intel processor, then the apps can be deployed to those Windows tablets. Jim has I think a Dell tablet running Windows 10, and we've been able to use the Bluetooth and Bluetooth LE and get FireMonkey apps running just fine on again, Intel-based Windows 10 tablets. We don't support Android on Intel, although you can take Android apps on certain versions of Android, and it's got the Limp Houdini technology, which allows you to use Android APK files, and under the covers, the Intel processor converts ARM instructions into Intel instructions. Again, check out our platform status page. I put the links in the Q&A and the chat window. The platform status page talks about the current platform and operating system support for the different versions of our products, as well as any workarounds or updates that fix things that may have been changed in the underlying operating system updates. Stay tuned to that platform status page as new versions of macOS, Android, iOS come out in the coming weeks and months as well. Of course, the platforms are moving targets. People were asking about tutorials and mobile tutorials. I put the link to all the tutorials that we have in the Doc Wiki. There's also a PDF of all the mobile tutorials that it combines all the mobile tutorials into an ebook that you can print out or that you can download. That's linked off the tutorials page as well. Okay. There was so for multi-tier, there's a question about data step multi-tier, RAD server multi-tier, REST multi-tier, web applications. Those are in the Enterprise Edition and above, or in the client server add-on pack if you have the Pro version. Automatic reference counting, or ARC, is on iOS and Android. It's on mobile. It's required on iOS. That's how memory management is done. So we added ARC there first for Delphi in XE4. We don't have ARC for desktop, so the best thing to do is to make sure you dispose of objects in either case, and ARC will take care of it. If you call dispose of on mobile and there's no counts left to the references, it'll be released. Disposable is a no-op if there's no references to an object. And ARC is enabled at anything that inherits from T-object. So the ARC reference counting on mobile is implemented in T-object, and then everything inherits from T-object. So if you create your own classes, if those classes don't inherit from ARC, from T-object, then you need to do your own memory management on those objects. If you inherit from T-object, then ARC is built in on mobile. And I put the links to ARC documentation. There's a white paper by Marco Cantu, and Marco Cantu covers ARC in his, I believe, in his Object Pascal handbook as well. Okay. Let's see. So again, FireDAC is a data access control. There was some confusion, I think, about data snap versus FireDAC. Data snap is a multi-tier technology, so is RAD server. And building REST servers, you can use FireDAC data access components in your applications, both for desktop and mobile and server side. So that's what's there. There was a question about any advantages of Delphi over C++ Builder or vice versa, the language. They're basically two different languages in our case for doing the same kind of high-level application programming. Delphi and C++ Builder both support VCL, FireMonkey, the RTL. It's the same IDE that's used by both languages, same designer, and so on. It's just different programming language. So Both are object-oriented programming languages with all the standard features. C++ has some additional things. Delphi has some additional things. So, choose the language that you like to use between the two, Delphi or C++. On mobile, they both use the same optimizer and code emitter through LLVM toolchain. So the code should be very similar if you're comparing language syntax elements. Somebody was asking about how to connect to Office, Excel, Office, Word, and so on. I put a link to an article that talks about how you can automate through COM automation Office from Delphi. If you install via components, install and add the ActiveX interfaces for Office that are defined by Microsoft, then all of a sudden you get a whole bunch of components at the document, at the cell level, and so on to get to Excel and Office and all the other Office automation interfaces that Microsoft documents. There was a question about multiple forms and the multi-device designer, and Jim showed that the multi-device designer allows you to choose the style and then choose the view, and you can create multiple views. And then at link time, depending on the target platform, the IDE and compilers and resource management will use the right form files. So the main format form file, and then if you have an Android 7-inch or Android 10-inch or iOS 4-inch and so on, since it uses form inheritance over the covers, you'll get the master view and then anything that you might have changed property-wise and so on in the specific device views. And again, you saw that at design time, how you can choose to have multiple views, and that's how the multi-device designer works. Under the covers, it's using form inheritance in the form streams to get for the target platform the correct property settings and components you're using and so on. There was a question about using different versions of Delphi and different versions of the Android SDK, and again, that's done by the SDK manager. You can bring up the SDK manager and do the correct settings and paths to the Android SDK and NDK that you want to use. You can use the SDK installer for Android to go and choose the right API versions, and that's linked off of when you have Pro and above with multi-device development, there's a batch file that launches the underlying Android SDK manager, so you can download samples, documentation, and the right APIs that you need to use for your different devices, depending on what you've installed on those devices. And then through the platform configurations, you can choose the paths to the different Android SDKs and NDKs that you have installed on your Windows machine, and then the IDE will use the correct SDK for your target platform named configuration. You can create multiple named configurations as well. And there's videos for all of that, setting up your development environment, setting it up for Android development, setting it up for iOS and Mac OS and Windows development. There was a question about building a REST server itself, and there are a couple things. Craig Chapman did a skill sprint on building a REST server from scratch, and then also we have a longer form webinar we did about building a REST JSON-based enterprise business application using RAD server. So there's several ways to build REST-based servers. If you just want to build a very simple REST-based server from scratch, then Craig Chapman's video replay from Skill Sprint is linked in the Q&A. There was a question about FireDAC and T-Client dataset. T-Client dataset is a local store dataset with filtering and lets you persist data out to local storage. It comes from our Midas technology from years ago. You can still use T-Client dataset even if you're using FireDAC. FireDAC has some really cool extra components. One is TFD memtable. It's an in-memory data set, and you can store the data in binary, I think in JSON form, locally persist it and bring it back in. There's T-local SQL component, FD the local SQL, and I put the link to all of the FireDAC skill sprints we did. I think it was last year we did something like 12 or 13 FireDAC specific short form developer skill sprints, and so you can learn all about FireDAC by watching those skill sprints, including FD memtable. Kerry Jensen also did a RAD in action, so if you search Kerry Jensen, FireDAC, and client data set, you'll find a white paper and a replay. We'll get those into the blog post as well, where he compares and talks about client data set versus FD memtable. But again, you can still use client data set component even if you're using FireDAC. Client data set takes a data source, so you can have a data source connected to a FireDAC SQL or table operation. FireDAC is, somebody asked, is there a free version of FireDAC? FireDAC comes in the professional edition, and if you wanted for local database access, if you want to do remote database access, then you need the client server add-on pack so that you can talk to remote SQL Server databases, Oracle, whatever, Postgres, and so on. Okay. There was a question about what do you do when you have a form on a mobile device, for example, where the form doesn't fit some of the form fields. And in that case, you should use because the virtual keyboard is going to come up from the bottom, for example, or pop up. There's a sample that I put the link to. It's the FMX scrollable form sample. You can use a vertical scroll box and then put your list box and other things inside the vertical scroll box and your other parts of a form. And then you can use that with code, and the sample does this. It pushes the form up enough so when the virtual keyboard appears, it's not covering the edit fields that you have. So check out the FMX scrollable form sample in the code examples in the doc wiki, and I put the link in the Q&A log. So, okay, so VCL to FMX again is meta converter. So go to metaconverter.com. I put that link in the Q&A log. So there's a question about live binding and field width and about string grids. And so to have the control, you can write code to see the length of the largest field that would fit in a column and then set the column width to that size. The best thing is to right mouse click on the string grid, and they'll come up a columns editor, and that columns editor allows you to see all the columns that are coming from the live binding from the data set, and you can set the column widths appropriately at design time to start. Ultimately, you may want to do something when your query happens to read down all the selected rows and see the widths of the largest column data in each column, and then set the column size. And you can change the column size in code just as you would do it at design time in the form designer. Okay, so let's see. So there was a question about zero-based strings, and there's a link to zero-based strings in the doc wiki that's put there. There was a question about zero-based strings available for desktop apps. How does it work to migrate old applications from one-based strings to zero-based strings? Again, there's coverage of that in the doc wiki entry in the Q&A log. There's a question about isn't everything inherited from T-object by default?
So if you create a class and you don't specify an ancestor, then it will inherit from T-object effectively, even though that isn't defined. But there are some classes that change the object lifetime, like the ref counting is actually controlled in code, and you can actually override that if you wish. And so some classes do that. They do change how the lifetime of objects that are instances of a particular class works. But in general, the rule of thumb is that if you have a class, ref counting works as you would expect.
This question here about Oracle access components, direct access. FireDAC calls into the Oracle API under the covers to do operations. So you can use FireDAC just fine. FireDAC uses the client library. So all is good there. There's a question about Universal Windows programs or UWP support. Come to Marco Cantu is doing a session in September. I think it's September 22nd? Go to the community calendar. Let me bring that up myself. I believe it's September 22nd. Marco's going to be talking about the Windows 10 Anniversary Edition, as well as it's on September 22nd. So let me get that link for you and put it in the Q&A log. And so Marco is going to be talking about how you can take what Microsoft called at the time what's Project Centennial. It's a way of taking Win32 apps, native apps, Win64 native apps, and running them on Windows 10 in that world and get them into the store and so on. So he's going to cover all of that on the 22nd of September. Okay. There's questions about what's included in which edition of RAD Studio and or Delphi and so on. And in all cases, I refer you to the feature matrix. The quick specific question was about building REST servers. There's lots of ways to build REST servers. You could use the Project Indy components, HTTP, and build a server-side app that just listens for HTTP calls. After all, REST is HTTP with some URIs and JSON data in the body. So, but if you look at the feature matrix and go down, if you want to use the REST components, then those are in Pro and Enterprise, I believe. But if you want to build a REST server, there's lots of ways to build a web or REST server, including using WebBroker. And then we have JSON parsers in the RTL for creating JSON, writing JSON, and parsing JSON. So DataSnap has a REST choice. If you want to say file new DataSnap REST server for multi-tier, you can also, RAD server is REST server. That's our EMS or Enterprise Mobility server. That's only REST and JSON. So you can check out RAD server or EMS server in the documentation. And that is REST and JSON there. But otherwise, for a REST server, check out Craig Chapman's Building a REST Server skill sprint. I put the link in the Q&A log and I think in the chat window as well. Okay. What about Xbox and Connect? We don't do anything specific for Xbox. Microsoft is doing some things to allow certain kinds of Windows 10 apps to run on Xbox, but we don't do any specific. We've done things with the Microsoft Connect device, letting you do gestures with the cameras it has built in. Check out some work by Simon Stewart. He had a set of components that worked with the Connect device from Microsoft. HTML5 Builder is still in the RAD Studio pack. That was a question that just came in, and so the answer to that is yes.
I think it was quite a lot, so thanks for answering all those. I saw a couple of other questions which are probably worth addressing. There was a question about how to use Android from Starter. So Starter only supports Windows 32-bit, and you need Pro plus Mobile to use Android or iOS, and you can upgrade quite easily. I think we have a link in the chat log. And related to that, there's a question on how to deploy to devices like iPads and Android tablets and that kind of thing. There is a deployment manager in the project menu, which also uses the platform assistant, and there's a link to the documentation about that. It's actually a step-by-step kind of walkthrough about how to deploy an iOS application. Android is slightly different, but there is similar documentation for that as well. I think pretty much everything else was covered.
Yeah, I'm just catching up on some of the questions I answered going along the way by typing them in anyway.
There are a couple of questions about JSON, actually, about using special characters. So JSON is Unicode, and Delphi strings are Unicode as well, so you can just type in any special characters and they should work. I think there's 6 specific characters like tabs that have escape sequences in JSON. I think it's like \T for a tab character, for example. And there's a link to some documentation that we put in the chat log. But apart from that, JSON's Unicode, Delphi's Unicode, you can just put a character straight in and it should work.
Yeah, I put a link to, there's certain escape characters that you might want to encode and special characters, but I put a link to a Stack Overflow. A really good question with some really good answers. So
there's another question here about actually using Delphi on Mac. So Delphi currently only runs on Windows, but of course you can deploy to Mac, and you need a Mac as well to deploy to iOS. You can just run Delphi in a virtual machine very easily. In fact, I'm speaking to you right now from a Mac, and I'm running Delphi inside Windows on Parallels. I've used VMware Fusion in the past as well. Both those are very easy, very integrated, very nice solutions for that.
yeah, I was just trying to catch up on this FireDAC, and there's lots of details on the FireDAC. Has its own doc wiki, and for each of the FireDAC support for different databases, there's additional information about specific things for different devices or different databases like Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server. So, and then if you have other questions, best way is to go into the news groups for FireDAC, and Dimitri, who's the chief architect of FireDAC and creator of FireDAC, he's really good about answering questions there, and then he puts those most asked questions back in the FireDAC doc wiki. So when you get into specific questions about specific databases, go to the database connectivity page for FireDAC. I'll put that in the chat window, and then from there you can go to the database of your choice. And beyond that, there's common FAQ questions that are also on the FireDAC doc wiki. They'll put that link in the chat window as well. It's got general questions and then specific questions across the different databases about, so for example, for Oracle and so on. So check out the frequently asked questions page on the FireDAC doc wiki, as well as your favorite database. In particular, look at the database connectivity help that is in the FireDAC doc wiki. Okay. A mobile add-on pack is included in the mobile add-on pack is included in Architect and Enterprise editions. Yes. It's also included in Rad Studio Pro. So if you have Rad Studio Pro, which includes Delphi and C++ Builder, it also includes the mobile add-on pack, Rad Studio. But if you have Delphi Pro, you'll need to do the mobile add-on or upgrade to Enterprise Architect.
So there's a question earlier about using zero-based strings and whether that was possible on desktop. The answer is yes. There is a conditional that you can turn on. There's a link in the chat log. Zero-based strings. That's a per block conditional, so you can turn that on or off very locally in your code, and you can check it with an ifdef. But much better approach is to use, for example, the low primitives that you might be used to for arrays to get the first and last valid indices. They work with strings now as well. So you can just iterate, for example, low string to high string. The string helpers, so the record helpers or type helpers that were introduced in XC3, I think, operate on strings, and they always used zero-based indices as well, even on desktop. So it's much better to stick to the primitives, such as using low and high, and then the right thing just happens automatically. But you can check the behavior if you need to.
Yeah, there was questions about which, when you want to do everything on a Mac, but we have Windows ID, which should you use? Should you use some kind of VirtualBox or Parallels for Mac, or VMware, or Boot Camp? And Boot Camp you have to reboot each time when you want to switch back and forth on a Mac. I use Parallels. Others use VMware. Those are probably the two most popular VM guest operating systems that'll host Windows, Linux, and so on a Macintosh. I use a MacBook Pro, and I just upgraded to Parallels. I'm not a shareholder in the Parallels people or anything else. I use Parallels because I have for some time, but Parallels and VMware sort of stay step in step with each other mostly. And again, it allows you to run Windows as a guest operating system, Linux as a guest operating system. I have separate VMs for Windows 7 and Windows 10, and then I have Ubuntu as Linux, and then I'm running Mac OS 10 or Mac OS El Capitan right now, getting ready to upgrade to Sierra. And again, I want to remind everybody to stay tuned to the platform status DocWiki page. That is the latest information that our QA and engineering team gives to the documentation team. So when you hear about a new update for iOS or a new update for Android or an interim release of those or some kind of other bug fix or security fix or a new release of the operating system, wait until you see the platform status page being updated that tells you what works and what doesn't with a new release of an operating system platform, both for using the ID as well as targeting. And especially for the mobile systems, sometimes Apple and Google change things in interim releases that seem like very small, minor releases versus major releases. But before it's safe to go in the water, that's why we created the platform status page. It'll tell you what works and what workarounds or what updates you need or what source code changes you might need to make. And then you can always choose to create another VM and have some devices that are using beta versions of the upcoming operating systems from Apple, Google, or Microsoft. But for me, because people always ask us, because things are coming out all the time, what works and what doesn't, and what do you need to worry about. So I'm going to put in, again, the platform status page, and I'll put it in the chat window again as well. That's the main page. Bookmark that. We create VMs so we can test with the test versions of macOS, Android, iOS, and so on. And different devices and such. So the question about iOS emulators, for Delphi, we support the iOS simulator.
Just before you go on.
Yeah.
That's another reason to stick with subscription, because when new versions of Android and iOS come out, we update and we fix anything that we need to fix, and those are always available with subscription in the latest version. So it's an excellent reason to have subscription, so you always have the most up-to-date, most recent version of Delphi. Sorry, David, go ahead.
There was no, it was just somebody was asking about what do you do for emulators or simulators for iOS, and there's a couple ways to do that. One is we have direct iOS simulator support, so if you have a Macintosh, you can have your Windows ID connected to a Mac Mini or a MacBook or a Mac iMac or whatever it might be. Mac Mini, you can pick up Mac Mini as long as they're Intel-based Mac Minis that use the operating systems that we require in the platform support, and then you connect them over the network. There also is Mac and Cloud, and there are some other systems where you can use, run the simulator, can run in a cloud, and some businesses on the internet also have devices that you can test with where they have sort of devices connected to Macintoshes, and you can connect and do your testing by having Platform Assistant Server talk to that Macintosh that's running on the internet somewhere that has a device connected to it, and they have like a camera so you can actually see, or software so you can see what's happening on the actual device. So just check out all those different services that are available as well. There's a question about where to put the database file for the mobile app for like SQLite. Jim showed that when he was deploying applications, use the project deployment manager. And then you can put your database in the, assets internal. There's also a shared folder. You could put a file in a shared folder, but then it would be accessed by different, could be accessed by different applications. It's probably not something you'd want to do if it's got, data you don't want other people or apps to see. And then, as Jim showed, use the IOUtils unit. The tpath statement has all these different methods for getting the documents folder, and that page on the DocWiki, just search for DocWiki IOUtils, shows you what the result will be when you get the library path, for example, or you get the file path, what that is on each platform. On Windows, by default, it'll be My Documents for your logged in user that's running that specific app. On OS X, you could be in your Documents folder. It could be anywhere else. For Mac OS. iOS, it's going to be in your Documents folder, and that you specify by default when the application starts up, and then again on Android as it's internal. So all of that is documented, as well as you can set other paths that are inside of your application domain. For example, on iOS, using the project deployment manager, you choose the target of where your file is as part of the build and deploy process, and then you specify where you want that file to be placed. Could be a database file, could be an INI file, could be image files or music files or whatever it might be. So, and IOUtils makes it so you write one set of code across all the platforms to get your starting point application, where the application starts up, and where to get to the different document and other kinds of folders on each platform. So IOUtils, the tpath class, has a whole bunch of methods for helping you in that way. Okay. Let's see. There were several questions about when you see certain features in other apps that you're using that you don't find a component and or a runtime library or platform-specific library support. I think they mentioned like the power safe mode in Pokemon Go, for example, to dim the display. There are native APIs that you can call. You can use the OC class to get to an Objective-C library API, and you can use the Java class on Android to get to the Android NDK and SDK APIs that we haven't wrapped. There are utilities that we give you for taking operating system APIs like iOS APIs and creating Delphi interface units, and there's a Java to the number 2 OP that'll convert Java declarations that are available for Android from third parties and so on, and create Delphi interface units. So all those are available for you. Brian Long did a session, CodeRage, a couple sessions ago about calling into APIs for doing things like seeing if you're connected to the network or vibrating the phone for some user interface feedback in part of your apps. There are helper functions as well and helper classes for some of the APIs so that you don't have to do all of the low-level spelunking. But you have full access on Windows to the Windows API. There's a window handle, and the Windows API is the same on OS 10 or Mac OS, now iOS and Android. So everything is possible. For BPLs and DLLs on different platforms, I mean, a BPL is a package library. That's really a DLL that we use for the runtime libraries. DLL, those are usable on Win32 and Win64. Dylibs on Mac OS, and you can put those dylibs inside the application bundle or somewhere else along the path. On iOS, everything has to be inside of your application bundle. There's no dylibs that you can place somewhere on the machine. Only Apple really can do that. So you have to bundle in all your static libraries. That's why we give you static libraries for Interbase, for example, when you're building an iOS app, and for SQLite and other things. So the static libraries or static object files, .as, are linked in, and everything has to be part of the application bundle. On Android, we bundle the static libraries in. You can also put into an APK file a shared object, which is the Unix, Linux name for a dylib or a DLL, the .so file. There is a way on Android in a shared area to put some shared object files as well, but mainly best is to have everything in its own sandbox and executed inside of that little sandbox, that app, be part of that application bundle. That way other apps can't get at functionality that maybe you don't want to expose. Okay. For slides and samples, Jim will update. Jim couldn't join us. He's on the road this afternoon. He'll update his blog post to point to his slides and samples. He did that on Wednesday for his FireMonkey talk, where the slides and the samples were available. So there was a question about 64-bit Mac OS that's on the roadmap. There's the community roadmap. Fernando put the link to that August update article by Marco Cantu. There was a question about how libhoudini, or the Houdini project, it started by work done by Intel, and it's now merged into the Android delivery. And what it does under the covers is if you use ARM instructions on an Intel processor, so for example, Android on Intel, Intel on its processor chip has this ability to convert on the fly inside of the processor chip instructions that are for a different chip, or instructions it doesn't recognize as Intel instructions. And so that's how the Houdini under the covers works. It sees an instruction that's an ARM processor instruction. It translates it on the fly. And you can just search for libhoudini or Intel Houdini or Android Houdini project. It's a project, and they have a place if you find some code that you think should run, but it doesn't run on an Intel on Android processor, or Android on Intel processor, you can report a problem, and then they'll work to update the underpinnings for Houdini, where it does this processor exception, translates the instruction, and then continues executing it as it with an equivalent Intel instruction. Let's see. People are asking about calendars and event kit, and then you'll think about HomeKit and HealthKit on iOS and all these other kinds of kits, where we haven't wrapped all of the frameworks currently. It's just a never-ending work in progress. Again, you have low-level access to all the native APIs, and there's a link there to a Stack Overflow entry about how FireMonkey can access the calendar and events on Android. So that's one way. We can access now in Berlin the address book on iOS and Android. There's a T address book component, and Serena DuPont did a blog post a few months ago, so you can search for that one and look for the T address book documentation in the help and also on the doc wiki. And that allows you to get at the contacts on your phone for iOS and Android. And I think one of the samples that we have is you take a picture and then you attach that picture to a contacts in your contacts application and storage on your smartphone. And so that's a good demonstration of the T address book integration that was added in 10.1 Berlin. Let's see. So there's a question about getting styles installed. I mean, there's two parts of that. There's the styles that you want to put on your hard drive so the IDE and your applications can use them. And they're on the user public documents, Embarcadero Studio 18.0. There's a styles folder, and you'll see different subdirectories for the different platforms with the specific styles for Android, iOS, and so on, and some general styles as well. And then there's a link that Fernando put into the working with native and custom FireMonkey styles on the doc wiki for Berlin. So that's in the Q&A log for you. Question here about background application on smartphones and devices. For Delphi, we added support for Android services. So there's an Android services wizard that you can create, and we've got some documentation about that in the doc wiki. And Fernando pointed to Daniele Spinetti's article on using location sensor on Android service. So on Android, we support services in Delphi, and that came in, I think, in Seattle. And then on iOS, there's a setting under project options. I think it's in the version info for setting background. Let me find that that link as well. But you there's an option you can set for setting your application to run in the background on iOS. So iOS, I'm doing the same search in Google as well as in the doc wiki. So let me just paste that in, because that comes in handy when you want to, for example, if you're doing a fitness app for something like that, you don't really want to be drowning out the battery by using the screen on all the time. But yeah, it's let's see. Okay. Oh, it's not finding that. Well, I put the link in there for deploying your iOS application, and then about background, running the background in the running it in the background, so that way you're not chewing up screen time. If you want to, for example, do fitness tracking using the location sensor and changes of location and so on. Yeah, okay. Question about authenticating users with REST. We provide several different REST-based components for authorization, including just simple or basic authentication, OAuth 1, OAuth 2, but you could also hook events to do your own custom authentication if you've got your own REST server that you're building. Let's see, JSON versus XML comparison. Yeah, there was a link there on json.org that was put in, so thanks, Victor, for that. Okay. There's a question about FireDAC access for MS Access later editions beyond 2010. 2010, we have the native components, and we go to Access. I suspect there is the FireDAC to ODBC bridge. I would think you could use, if you have a more recent ODBC driver for Microsoft Access 2012 through 2016, you could use that ODBC driver and use the FireDAC to ODBC bridge, but I haven't tried that myself. This is David I, by the way. Question about if you've got lots of components in the live binding system, lots of tables and database access components and user interface elements. Probably first means you may have, for a specific form, too much on that form, or in a data module, too many things on the data module. And you can create multiple data modules in multiple forms, but at least multiple data modules to simplify when you're talking to, 60 database tables or 20 databases with lots of tables. You can also do layering or filtering with the live bindings view, where you can specify a certain number of visual and non-visual components in the live bindings designer, and then switch between those layers so that you only see at one time those components, visual and non-visual components you're binding to each other in the live binding designer at that given time. And you can also then say, show me all of it. You can also clean up the layout. There's a button for relaying out all the components, and then you can drag them around and save them as a bitmap and print them out or put them in your documentation and so on. And again, the layering, you can choose how you want to identify the layers so that you can switch between layers and that make sense to you when you're using the layers. Okay. How to call the live bindings designer? Well, I mean, you can view the live bindings designer in the IDE, but if you're talking about using code, there are bind components, and there are binding components. If you search for the doc wiki in the live bindings and data binding sections, there are components just like there are other components for database access or for data sources and so on. And so the binding wizard, if you want to use that, you turn that on through the tools, options, environment options. There's an environment option for turning on the live bindings wizard, which is the right mouse click to bring up the multi-step wizards for doing live bindings. That's off by default, but if you want that menu item to show up in your pop-up menu, then it's tools, options, environment, and scroll down in the environment settings, and one of those settings will be the live binding wizard, and you just put a check to turn it on, and then go back and right mouse click and you're there. To view the live bindings, there's a view live bindings designer, and you can have that be part of your desktop if you want to see the bindings while you're dropping components down and editing components and connecting to databases and so on. Houdini is free. There's a question about what does Houdini cost. It's free. It's provided by Intel to Android distributions. And it's included, I think, since maybe KitKat, if I remember correctly, and beyond. So there's a question about what about dealing with different versions of different platforms, and we have the link was put into the target platforms. There's also the platform status page. I'll put that link in. And the platform status page for the doc wiki is right off the main. It's right off the main docwiki.embarcadero.com. Under each target platform or product, you'll see a link called platform status. But let me put that link in the Q&A log, and I'll put it in the chat window as well. There it is. So what platform status is for each version of our product from 10.1 Berlin going back to exe4, and then for the different versions that each of those supported of Windows versions, Mac OS, iOS, and Android, we tell you which version is supported, and then if there's an asterisk next to it, you can scroll down to each platform, and we have specific notes about make sure you have update 1 of Seattle, for example, if you want Rad Studio 10 Seattle support for OS 10 El Capitan. So again, there's notes on that docwiki.embarcadero.com platform status /English for English, Japanese, and so on, /en/main_page, capital M, capital P. So, and that link is in the chat window. You want to bookmark that and refer to that all the time. We're very close now to the release of Mac OS Sierra, I guess 10.12, Sierra, iOS 10, and then there's Android versions percolating out there all the time as well, and then Microsoft doing updates to Windows 10. So we use this platform status page for all the supported platforms and operating systems to add notes, pointers to workarounds, and which updates and which tools you need to be using. So usually whenever there's a new release of macOS or iOS, there's a new Xcode. And so that information is on the supported target platforms page in the DocWiki, and which tools you need for developing and deploying, since we don't ship Xcode with Delphi. Let's see, how big can SQL data be on a mobile device? That's a good question. Probably the memory space, storage space of the device. I think some Android devices allow you to put in secondary memory cards, little small drives to give you secondary storage. So I don't think of a limit that way, just like I don't think of a limit of how big SQL data can be on a server or on a desktop. It's whatever disk space and memory space. So, I mean, it depends on the database you're using if it has a limitation. If you're using, for example, IB Lite is free to deploy. It lets you have a database of 100 megabytes, but then you can go to interface to go, and then there's no limit on the size, and it also supports encryption, and then interface server supports encryption and any size database as well. SQLite, you have to go to each of the database providers to see if there's some limit on how big database can be. Yeah, there's always questions here about when will the next update be available for any version of our product, and ultimately that's when it's ready. We'll let you know. We'll announce all of that. So stay tuned. At the same time, if you find problems, you can go and post them in the quality portal, quality.embarcadero.com, or you can search for problems that people have already reported. Oftentimes they'll put workarounds that worked for them, or we'll put workaround notes in those entries as well. You can also vote for features that you want in future versions of the product, and product management looks at those as part of the business planning as well. Let's see, here's a question about when should I use frames versus forms in apps? Well, you need to have at least a form, at least one form, and then frames can fit inside. Frames can be used in forms. So I think there's no general guideline other than if you think about if there's a pattern of user components, user visual and non-visual components that you're using all the time, you might consider putting those in a frame and then use that frame on multiple forms, rather than duplicating the components by hand each time on each form. Originally when FireMonkey came out, it didn't have support for frames, so you had to put everything into forms. But then later on, and I forget which version it was where frames came in, maybe XE4 or XE5. And frames are nice because you can use a frame and then override parts of it. You can inherit a frame, do frame inheritance, and change some parts of the frame. So just as you would reuse objects, think about reusing frames. Right, so that's probably the best guidance. Again, if you see that you're using a similar pattern of use of components together on multiple forms, you might put all those in a frame and then use that frame multiple times on different forms. And I'll leave that as the guidance, I think, for all of you. Even if you don't inherit from a frame and make changes to parts of it because you need something on a different form. I usually don't track. There's a question about Meta Converter, which version works with 10.1 Berlin. Just go to metaconverter.com. He tells you if his latest release, what versions of Delphi, C++, Builder, Rad Studio it supports. I know he's got a Berlin version that's there, and he had that probably back in May, maybe June. He had that done. So it says if a frame is bigger than a frame window in an app, will the frame be scaled? The only way things might scale is if you're using layouts. I mean, if you're using a layout that would, as the whole container inside of a frame and that you have all your components positioned, anchored, and doing alignments and so on in a frame and or a form for that matter, then if you put that frame inside of a form and you resize the form, hence the frame would scale if you've done layouts. So Jim, on Wednesday, go rewatch Wednesday. I'm going to re-render the video because some people said parts of the audio were out of sync. So I'm going to re-render day 3 and re-upload it to YouTube this afternoon and or this evening, depending on timing. And so Jim talked about using a combination of anchors, alignments, padding, margins, all of that, and then using layouts to have nice looking applications at different resolutions, and Jim showed more of that today as well. So following those guidance, and if you go to the doc wiki and go to the layout section, there's a really good discussion of which layouts you should use for different types of application use. Whether, grid layouts, for example, are really good for toolbars, right, where you're putting buttons, or button bars, where you're putting a bunch of common size speed buttons or whatever on a toolbar and a panel and so on. So having a kind of grid layout versus a flow layout is good oftentimes for different kinds of fill-in forms and such. Multi-view is another really good one that Jim showed on Wednesday. That works out great. You see that all the time in applications on smartphones with that little hamburger icon where the drawer pops out of speed buttons, or in a sense pop-up menu items, and then it closes back up so you still get the full screen. We talked earlier today about what if your form doesn't fit completely on the screen and then the virtual keyboard pops up. We have an example tutorial that uses the vertical scroll box. And what you can do is change the vertical scroll box in your code, so as you move from field to field and the keyboard comes up, it'll push the form up so that the keyboard is not hiding an entry field in your fill out form, for example, on a smartphone. So check out the vertical scroll box and the sample that's in the doc wiki. Just search for vertical scroll box. And then you can have your form move up as you're using the virtual keyboard on these small smartphone devices. So, okay. Somebody's asking about iOS 10. Well, iOS 10 is not out yet. macOS Sierra is not out yet. They're due out soon, and our team has been playing with all of the beta releases or developer preview releases for those. So stay tuned to get into that platform status page. We will update the platform status page for once macOS 10.12 comes out and iOS 10 comes out. So they're still not out yet, and we found that we track all along the way as these different platforms are in field test and beta and preview releases. But occasionally Apple, Microsoft, and others put little changes right at the last minute. We've seen that happen before. So even if we said this is the final beta and we were supporting it, if something got changed by Microsoft or Google or Apple at the last minute, we'd still have to respond and do something else to it. So what we do is we have lots of virtual machines, and we have our machine that works with the deployed operating system and our shipping product. And then many of us have separate VMs and separate devices where we have the test versions of iOS and Android and so on. And our QA teams are constantly testing to see if anything's getting broken, and also new features that we need to wrap with interface units and or components for new features. So that's a never-ending process. We signed up for that when we first started supporting more than just Windows only. So stay tuned, and again, bookmark that platform status page in the doc wiki. And when we say iOS 10 and that maybe you need an update or a workaround or a new source file, that'll be in the notes with little asterisks that'll be on that platform status page when you scroll down for each platform and each version of the product. So that's how we do it. And that's the page you really want to be alerted when changes are made to it, the platform status page. And also Marco Cantu, Jim McKeeth, everybody, Serena, everybody blogs when the new operating systems are released, and to let you know when it's safe to go in the water. Okay, let's see. Is there a mobile platform version of file-based database as in client dataset? You can still use client dataset on iOS and Android. You can use TFD memtable, which is the FireDAC in-memory dataset. Both of those client dataset and FD memtable can persist their data to local files, to either an internal format or maybe a JSON format. In client dataset, I think, also had its own called CDS file. It's just a binary format of the data. So you can still use a client dataset and TFD memtable on all platforms: Windows, Mac OS, iOS, and Android. So both of those. So you can use client dataset, TFD memtable, work on all platforms. Okay. So yeah, you can keep your client dataset code if you want with your filters and aggregations, or you can use TFD memtable and its ability to do operations as well. Okay, I don't know if David M., I know Jim is on the road. He's sort of Skyping back and forth.
I'm here, yes.
Okay, I don't know if there was other things over on either Facebook or YouTube that were...
I think a couple of other questions. There were some questions about all the days being up on YouTube, and we have a playlist up on YouTube, but even better than using that would be to use the blog posts, because we have a blog entry for each day on blogs.embarcadero.com, and as well as including the YouTube link, each entry includes downloadable source or resource links and other things like that.
So on, yeah, I know. If for people who use slides, there's slide links. I didn't use slides on day one, so but
That's right.
Yeah, and I put the
but lots of material.
Yep.
There's a question as well about people who have who want to move to like a snazzier UE, and you're moving from VCL to FireMonkey. I think we probably touched on this earlier, actually, because David, you were talking about using MIDA converter. Moving to FMX, I mean, that works on all platforms, and it does give you support for a lot of very nice UE features for graphics and animations and effects and transitions, and your scaling, and of course you can have all the different UE layouts depending on the platform and that kind of thing. So yes, no, that's definitely a good move to make if you want that kind of UE tweak. And let's see, there's a question about using Android on Starter, and Starter only includes Win32 support out of the box, so you have to upgrade to the professional with mobile add-on pack to get iOS and Android.
Yeah, there's
we actually have a... Sorry, David, you're saying something?
Oh, there's a special offer right now, right, on the shop site.
There is, yes. So you can upgrade from Starter, and of course you got Starter from free, but you can also upgrade not just to Pro, but to Pro plus Mobile for, I think, the same price as just Pro right now. So that could be well worth taking advantage of.
Yeah, I'll put the link to the shop site for Delphi. You can also go from Starter to Rad Studio if you want Delphi and C++, but it's you can upgrade from Starter to Pro, and then let's see. Well, maybe the promo ran off. Well, anyway, if I go to Rad off, oh, here. Oh, I don't know which page I'm looking at anymore. Let's try Rad offer. I know the promotion was only running for a certain amount of time, so, yeah. So if you go to the Rad offer page, I'll put that in the chat window. as well. And so just go to embarcadero.com/rat offer. The headline says free mobile add-on pack. So it says buy or upgrade to the professional edition and receive the mobile add-on pack for free. So that's from contact our sales office or resellers. Yep. Then if you need client server or remote database support and you have Pro, then there's the FireDAC client server add-on pack. Go ahead, David.
Great, thanks. The discussion here is all about using Delphi on macOS. So the IDE itself only runs on Windows, but of course you can build and deploy projects to macOS as well as to iOS and Android and Linux Server soon in the next release. But what you can do is you can run the IDE in Windows in a virtual machine, like Parallels or VMware Fusion. I think David, you and I both use Parallels, but I've used VMware Fusion in the past as well. They're both excellent products. And in fact, that's what I do. I'm talking to you now from a Mac, and I have a VM running with Delphi. So that's a good solution.
Yeah, for a while I was using VMware, but there was somewhere along the way years ago where Parallels did something better for me doing Mac and iOS and Windows development. So I got on the Parallels for Mac desktop. I'm up to version 12 now, the latest version that supports Sierra. And but then what usually happens is one of the two of those, VMware Fusion or Parallels, sort of leapfrogs the other one. I just gave up switching back and forth between them and upgrading both of them. But you can look at those. Some people use VirtualBox and some people just boot camp, reboot their Macintosh to go between Windows and Mac. I find that because of the way the IDE running on Windows, that boot camp doesn't work for me. Some people have a Windows notebook or desktop and they have a Mac Mini because they're pretty cheap. You just need an Intel-based Mac Mini. Put it on the network next to your machine, hook your iOS device into it, and do your development that way. That's a really low-cost solution too. You can probably pick up a used Mac Mini for a couple $100 US. Again, make sure it can run latest versions of the operating system, that it has Intel processor with memory that's required, and the system requirements for doing development are on the doc wiki and in the data sheet as well. So there's a question on this end about, can third-party components be used on mobile just as easy as on desktop? Well, it depends on where those visual components inherit from. But we have third-party vendors who have components for mobile, including TMS software and others. There's some third-party vendors and tech partners who are still only supporting VCL and Windows. But yes, T-Chart, for example, we ship a subset of T-Chart in the Pro Edition and above, and Stima software has full T-Chart for multi-platforms for Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android. So yes, visual controls can be moved over. TMS also has, they've created component wrappers for all the native controls for iOS and Mac OS, and you can purchase those component wrappers direct from them if you want to use ICL and MCL libraries to do native code. On FireMonkey, you just there's a setting on each component whether you want it to use styled or native. You'll see that on if you put a button down or you put an edit box down or a memo down, and it puts a little gray bitmap in the corner of the display area on the form designer to let you know that you've got a native. It has a little smartphone looking thing, versus if it's styled, then it's just an empty edit container or memo. And the team, I think, David, you could probably answer this better, is continuing to work on adding more native control support. Right now you can mix native and styled, but then you have to think about Z order and so on. You can always say native, but if there isn't one, then FireMonkey Into the Covers will fall back to styled. But I know the team's working on adding more native controls support right into FireMonkey.
That's right, yeah. So we have native controls on iOS and Windows at the moment, and we have some items in the roadmap for our plans for adding native controls to Android. So check the roadmap for details on that. There's a question here that harks back to something I said about the FMX on different platforms, which was a query about using different UEs for each platform. So yes, the way to do that is to use the multi-device designer. And so I'm not sure if Jim covered that today or not, but basically you create your UE as you normally would in the form designer, and there's a drop-down combo box up the top where you can choose several platforms, and you can tweak or change the UE per platform. Conceptually, it's a bit like subclassing codes. You have your main master view, and then you have the conceptually subclassing, I suppose, per platform. And so per platform, you can change or tweak your UE as much as you want. And then what happens is that the right version for that platform will be loaded when the form is created. So you can create an iPad version and an Android phone version and that kind of thing. And then when you build your application and when you run your application, the right version will be loaded depending on what device the app is actually running on, which is very cool. Saves a lot of time doing different UE design and that kind of thing based on different form factors and different devices and that kind of thing. It's very useful.
Someone was asking what I recommend for database on mobile platforms today, and for me, IB Lite is free to deploy. It's full ANSI SQL 92. It just has a 100 megabyte limit on the database size, but it's full SQL, full data types, stored procedures, triggers, all of that, and then you can quickly change to Interface to Go, which adds full size and encryption. And all you do is change the deployment option in Project Deployment Manager, and then you get a key you purchase for a number of for the deployment for an IB to Go. But you can start with IB Lite. You actually get a key when you purchase client server add-on pack or the Pro and Enterprise editions. You get IB Lite key, and then you can deploy. And then if your SQL database starts getting larger for your mobile app, you can come back and purchase an Interface to Go deployment key from our sales office as a reselling partner. So it's a great way to start. And again, the beauty is full SQL, fully compatible across the different platforms for IB Lite, and then Interface to Go gives you encryption at the database and at the column level. And then if you want to go to multi-tier, then you could have Interbase running on a server, Windows Server, Linux server, and so on. And it's the same metadata. You just take the same Interbase database file and copy it between mobile and server and desktop without having to change anything in the database itself. They're all compatible across the different platforms, the data and metadata as well. Let's see. Well, the mobile preview pane support landscape. It supports landscape and portrait, and the live preview gives you that on each device that you connect. So you could see in the preview in the IDE what it looks like. In the designer, you just click the portrait landscape toggle in the upper right-hand corner of the design window. But if you're doing live preview to devices, just connect all your devices up, and you can see live preview of standard components and the form on tablets and smartphones in whatever orientation you want. And then if you want it physically constrain it, you go to Project Options, Application, and there's Orientation as a sub selection under there, and you could decide to only support landscape and maybe only landscape with the home button on the right-hand side and so on. So the answer is absolutely. You can control and view and preview portrait landscape, the different form factor sizes that Jim was showing you on setting up your different views. And then through live preview, and Jim's got a video that's out there on the how-to videos, how to use live preview as well.
So there's another question that came in about using another target platform, Android or iOS in Starter. So yeah, we mentioned this very slightly earlier, but you need Pro plus Mobile for iOS and Android. And there's a promo on right now to get the mobile add-on when you upgrade to Pro from Starter. So check out embarcadero.com/rad offer for that. it's worth taking advantage of that. A couple of other questions.
Go ahead.
So there's one about, sorry, David?
No, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. There's a question here about UWP apps. And so the Windows 10 Anniversary Edition is bringing out something called Centennial, which helps wrap sort of desktop apps rather like UWP. And we have a webinar coming up where Marco is going to talk about Windows 10 Anniversary Edition and our support for it and taking advantage of Centennial and that kind of thing. And I think that's all the questions I have here to answer.
Okay.
So, David, unless you have more on your end?
No, that's all of them here in GoToWebinar as well. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today and maybe all week long as well. I will get the replay of day 3. Right now, the day 3 in the playlist has the sort of live stream that was happening and the audio and videos out of sync. So I'm going to pull that one down and re-render the day 3 replay and put that in the playlist. And then I've captured everything that we're doing here on day 5, and I'll be putting that up this afternoon or this evening. So again, bookmark the playlist and the blog posts, and we'll update the links to the replays in each of the blog posts and the main announcement of Bootcamp. And again, refer to each of those day pages to get to the links for samples, slides, and other resource links. So David M., thank you.
Well, thank you too, David, and thank you everyone who attended and who asked all the questions. And it's been a fantastic webinar, I think. So thank you all.